The thing that nobody talks about, the thing that makes this specific account different from every other wilderness disappearance on record, is that it started not with fear, but with relief. Mervyn Holt had spent 19 years working for the U.S. Forest Service before he ever saw something he could not explain away. 19 years walking the Ocala National Forest, which covers roughly 607 square miles of longleaf pine and Blackwater River in north central Florida. He knew the place the way a butcher knows a carcass, not with love necessarily, but with absolute anatomical certainty. He had cataloged every named trail, every unmarked footpath, every section of wetland that swallowed GPS signals and spat them back distorted. He had seen 2 drownings, 1 lightning strike, in the aftermath of a meth lab fire that consumed 43 acres in the summer of 2009. He had seen things that should have disturbed him. They did not. He was proud of that. His colleague for 11 of those years was a woman named Drusilla Fain, hired fresh out of a wildlife biology program at the University of Florida in 2004. Drusilla was precise in a way that some people at the district office found irritating. She documented, she photographed, she maintained a personal log separate from the official one, written in a cramped, almost mechanical hand in black-covered moleskin notebooks that she dated, indexed, and filed in chronological order in a locked cabinet in her office at the Alexander Springs station. She had 41 of those notebooks by the time she handed her badge to the district supervisor, walked to her truck, drove to her sister's house in Gainesville, and refused to return. That was October 14th, 2022. She has not spoken publicly about why she left. The third person in this account is Casimir Brode, who was not a ranger but a fire lookout stationed at a modified tower on the eastern edge of the forest near the border with Lake County. Casimir had been there since 2017. He was 53 years old, previously divorced, and according to several people who knew him, constitutionally incapable of embellishment. He had grown up in Ironwood, Michigan, in a household where exaggeration was treated as a mild moral failure. He was not a dramatic man. He was not given to storytelling. He did not drink. These 3 people, who had between them 47 years of professional experience in the same forest, agreed, in separate conversations, with separate people, in separate years, on one specific thing. Not on what they saw, not even on when precisely it began, but on one sensory detail that each of them described without being prompted, without knowing the others had described it, and without being able to explain it. They all mentioned the breathing. Not the sound of something breathing, not the impression of it, the actual rhythmic displacement of air against the back of the hand or the side of the neck, or, in Casimir's case, across the surface of a glass of water sitting on his desk inside the tower, which he described as rippling in a pattern that matched no wind he had ever seen. A slow pulse, too slow for an animal, too even for the forest. The first recorded anomaly in the official logs, not Drusilla's private notebooks, but the Alexander Springs Station's formal incident record, appears on September 3rd, 2019. Mervyn filed it. The language is bureaucratic and flat, and therefore more unsettling than it might otherwise be. He wrote, "Investigated reported disorientation of day hikers, party of 4, on the Yearling Trail between mile markers 6 and 9. All 4 individuals reported independently that the trail appeared to have changed direction without their moving. Party was uninjured and oriented upon exit. No medical emergency. Possible group confusion in low visibility conditions." The weather on September 3rd, 2019 in Ocala was clear, with visibility exceeding 15 miles. Mervyn, in a conversation he had 3 years later with a man named Odell Sark, who had been a seasonal ranger at the forest in 2011 and had since moved to a teaching position in Tallahassee, described the hikers differently than the log suggested. He said they were not confused. He said confusion was the wrong word. He said the look on the face of the woman in the group, a physician from Jacksonville named Parveen, whose last name he did not catch, was the look of someone who has just proven a theorem they did not want to prove. Not frightened, certain of something she did not know how to say. She kept turning around, not because she heard something behind her, but because she was checking that the trail behind her still existed in the direction she expected. Mervyn said that after they left, he walked that section of the Yearling Trail twice. Everything was as it should have been. He filed the report as he did because there was no other category. There was no form for what he had seen on that woman's face. Drusilla's private log for the same period, which Odell Sark has read and described in detail, though he declines to share photographs of the pages, contains an entry dated August 19th, 2019, 2 weeks before Mervin's incident. It is longer than most of her entries. She describes a standard wildlife survey in grid section 47-C near the edge of the Juniper Prairie Wilderness. She had been in that section dozens of times. She writes, and Odell transcribed this from memory, "The grid felt correct on paper, but incorrect in the body. This is not a distinction she would normally make." She writes that she noticed she had been holding her breath and did not know when she had started. She writes that she looked at the longleaf pines along the survey line and thought they were spaced correctly, but could not shake the feeling that they were spaced correctly because something had arranged them that way, rather than because they had grown that way. She writes, "I have felt this before, briefly, near water at dusk, when the light makes things look deliberate. This was different. This was midday. The light was ordinary." She does not mention it again for 6 weeks. Then, on September 29th, 2019, she writes a single line. Same section, the spacing again. "I stayed 4 minutes and left." Then a gap of 2 months. Then, in late November, a longer entry. She had been doing routine maintenance checks on a firebreak trail near Lake Delancey in the northern section of the forest, which is as far from Juniper Prairie as you can get while remaining inside the forest boundary. She writes, "I want to note that I have now had a version of the same experience in a location with no geographic similarity to the first. This makes it less likely that I am responding to a topographic feature." She lists, in bullet points, one of the few times in 41 notebooks where she uses bullet points, everything that was the same. The sense of arrangement, the held breath she only noticed after the fact, the feeling of being watched that she specifically distinguishes from the ordinary feeling of being watched, which she describes as directional, as coming from somewhere. This feeling, she writes, was not directional. It was ambient, like being watched by the weather. Casimir Broad's account is the most specific and also the most difficult to evaluate because he spent his days in a structure designed for observation and spent years developing the habit of checking the same visual field repeatedly in sequence. His job required him to notice small changes. He was, by training and temperament, a calibrated instrument. He told Odell Sark that it began in the spring of 2020, which he could date precisely because it coincided with the early weeks of the COVID lockdowns, when visitor numbers in the forest dropped dramatically and the ambient noise profile of the surrounding area changed in ways he had documented in his personal logs as part of what he called a baseline recalibration exercise. He was comparing the acoustic environment of the forest without human traffic to his long-term baseline. He was hearing the forest as it sounded before people. He said the first thing he noticed was not the breathing, but a category error in the bird sounds. He had spent 3 years learning the specific acoustic geography of the area visible from his tower, which species were active at which times, in which sectors of the tree line, responding to which stimuli. He described it as a form of oral mapping, something he had developed not as a professional exercise, but as a way to stay sane during long shifts. He knew when the red-headed woodpeckers worked the snag cluster on the northwest quadrant. He knew which trees the common nighthawks favored in the hour before dawn. He knew the characteristic alarm call sequence of the blue jays in the stand of old-growth oak at bearing 290 degrees. A particular sequence he described as 4 short calls and 1 long, repeated, always in response to a specific type of ground disturbance. On a morning in early April 2020, he heard the 4 short, 1 long blue jay alarm coming from bearing 112 degrees. The wrong direction. There were no old oaks at bearing 112. There were no blue jays he had ever logged at bearing 112. He raised his binoculars and found nothing. This did not alarm him. He noted it. 3 days later, he heard it again, bearing 112, the same pattern, 4 short, 1 long. He scanned for 20 minutes. Nothing. Over the following 6 weeks, he documented 9 separate incidents. The alarm call moved, Never back to the Oaks, but across the eastern quadrant in a slow arc that, when he plotted it on a schematic of his observation field, described something that was not quite a straight line and not quite a curve. It moved like something learning where it was. The breathing started in June of that year, during a period of intense heat when he kept the tower windows open at night. He described it as arriving between 1 and 2 in the morning, always from the east side of the tower, always the same pace. He used the word metronomic. He said it was not fast enough to be a large mammal. He said it was almost, but not quite, the rhythm of a sleeping human being. Slower, more deliberate, like the rhythm had been measured and then replicated with a slight correction, the way a person sounds when they are consciously slowing their breath to match someone else's, and overdo it slightly. He got a sound meter. He measured it on 4 occasions. The sound registered. It was not imagined. It had a frequency he did not recognize, and he sent the recordings to a colleague in the biology department of a university, whose name he asked Odell not to share. The colleague said the recording was interesting and asked if there had been weather disturbances. There had not. The colleague did not respond to subsequent messages. Drusilla's log from the same summer contains an entry, dated July 11th, 2020, that Odell Sark describes as the longest single entry in all 41 notebooks. He says it runs for 11 pages in her compressed handwriting, and that he could only read it once because of the physical reaction it produced in him, which he describes, with visible discomfort, as a sense of something being known about him that he had not disclosed. He will not quote from it directly. He says that what she describes is an encounter in the Juniper Prairie section that lasted approximately 40 minutes, during which she attempted to complete a routine survey and found that her documented route, a route she had walked no fewer than 30 times, was returning her to the same point. Not a different point, the same point. The same section of wire fence separating the wilderness area from a controlled burn zone. She walked in 4 different directions from that point, on 4 separate attempts, and returned each time. She writes, according to Odell, that the forest during this period did not feel hostile. She uses a specific word that he renders phonetically because he is not sure of the spelling, which he believes is the word solicitous, that it felt solicitous, that it felt like being helped. She left the forest that day and did not return to Section 47-C for 11 months. Mervin's account covers a single incident from March of 2021, which he describes as the reason he requested reassignment to desk duties, a request that was denied and that he renewed twice before it was partially accommodated. He had been responding to a report from a group of geocachers who had gotten turned around near the confluence of the Ocklawaha River and Lake Ocklawaha in the far western section of the forest. He parked at the standard access point off County Road 316 and walked in along the service road. He had done this particular walk more times than he could count. He knew the smell of that specific stretch of water, tannins, rotting vegetation, the particular sulfur note that came from the sediment in the deeper channels. He says that at some point during the walk-in, approximately 3/4 of a mile from the access point, the smell changed. Not dramatically. He is careful to say it was not a dramatic change. He describes it as a subtraction rather than an addition. The sulfur note was still there. The tannins were still there. What was gone was something he could not name because he had never thought to name it. A smell that he had simply filed as water. The smell of that specific water in that specific section. And that he only understood as a distinct component when it was absent. He stopped walking. He stood still for what he estimates was 2 minutes. He says that while he was standing still, the birds around him continued their normal activity. The insects continued. The wind moved through the palmettos at the right speed. Every sensory channel told him that everything was normal except for that one subtraction, that one removed note in the olfactory composition of the place. And the absence was so specific and so total that he could not convince himself it was his own nose failing. He says he turned around. He did not reach the geocachers. He called in a different ranger to complete the welfare check, citing a personal emergency, which was a lie. He sat in his truck for 45 minutes at the parking area on County Road 316 and watched the tree line. He says he is not sure what he expected to see. He says the tree line looked entirely normal. That was, he says, the problem. Casimir Brode requested a transfer in October of 2021. It was not approved until the following spring. During those months, he continued to document. His logs from that period show an escalation not in frequency, the incidents remained roughly monthly, but in what he calls resolution. Each time more detail, each time closer. He begins describing a quality of attention that he felt directed at the tower that was different from being observed and different from being tracked. He uses the words studied. He says it felt like being studied by something that was taking its time because it was not operating under any constraint of urgency. He says that was the most frightening part, the patience. His last documented incident before the transfer was April 3rd, 2022. He was working the overnight shift, which he rarely did. At approximately 2:40 in the morning, he heard the breathing from the east side, the first time in several months. It lasted 11 minutes by his log. During those 11 minutes, he did not move. He sat at his desk with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes open, and he says he understood, with the particular certainty that arrives not as a thought but as a physical sensation, that whatever was producing that sound was not approaching the tower. It had been at the tower for a long time. The sound was not a signal of arrival. The breathing was a kind of language. What it was saying he could not determine. That it was saying something, he had no doubt. He left his log on the desk when he transferred. He says he left it deliberately. He says if something had spent that long reading him, it seemed only fair. Drusilla Fain turned in her badge at the district office at 9:15 in the morning on October 14th, 2022. She gave no written explanation. She drove to her sister's house and has been there since. Mervyn Holt retired in January of 2023, citing health reasons. His medical records, which are not public, are described by those with access as unremarkable. Casimir Brode is reportedly working for a private forestry consulting company in the Pacific Northwest. He has not returned to Florida. The Ocala National Forest remains open to the public. The Alexander Springs Station is staffed. The trails are maintained. The Forest Service has no record of any formal investigation into the incidents described above. Odell Sark, who now teaches ecology and environmental science at Florida State, was asked whether he believed all three people were describing the same thing. He said, "I believe they were describing the same absence of something." He was asked to elaborate. He said, "The most frightening thing in the accounts is not what was there. Every account ends with something having been removed. The smell Mervyn lost, the birds in the wrong direction, the feeling of being helped. Something was learning to subtract itself from the environment. And the question that I keep coming back to, the question that none of them can answer because they were wise enough to stop going back, is whether it ever finished. Whether by now it has learned to be perfectly invisible. Whether it has been invisible and patient and present in every forest you have ever walked through, long before you arrived and long after you left. Whether the held breath you do not notice you are holding is yours. If this account reached you, share it and stay subscribed for the cases they still won't let us name.